Since the earliest days of Star Trek television shows, there have been Star Trek video games. Some games have followed particular movies or series plot points, while others have created their own stories using new and old characters. But the one constant across over 50 years of Star Trek games is that there have been both good and bad games, and in this video I'm going to take a look at what I consider to be my top 10 best Star Trek games. Now, I'm not saying that this list is any type of definitive guide to the best games. This is merely my choices, which have been shaped by my own personal experiences. I am very sure that at least one or two games on this list will be a surprise to many, and that's okay. Like I said, top 10s are always going to be subjective, and one of my favourite things about Trek and gaming in general is understanding others' opinions. With that all said, there are only two rules for this list. The first is that only one game per series may be listed, as in if Star Trek Armada is listed, Star Trek Armada 2 can't also be listed and vice versa. And the other rule is that I am not including any games which feature microtransactions. Before we continue, a massive thank you to those who support the channel. If you enjoy this type of content, please consider liking the video or subscribing to the channel. With that out of the way, let's kick things off at number 10. One of my all-time favourite multi-season plotlines of any Trek was DS9's Dominion War. I think the way the story was told across several seasons, along with some really solid acting, all contributed to it being a great plotline and overall a very satisfying conclusion to the Deep Space Nine series. Dominion Wars offers you the ability to play as either the Federation or Dominion and pretty much play out an alternate ending to the television series. An ending which, along with the overall plot of Dominion Wars, is really well thought out and definitely shows off a very high standard of writing to create a believable alternate ending. The game itself is a mixture of light strategy and 3D space combat. From a strategy perspective, you earn command points for every mission you complete, with you then being able to spend these points on acquiring new ships, captains, and crew to create your own custom fleet to then take into combat. You then control these ships through a fairly simplistic but with just enough depth combat system to complete mission objectives and progress the game. While the game does have its issues, ranging from some questionable level design to areas of the game which at times feel unfinished, Dominion Wars is the only real standalone Trek game which lets you play through the famous series conflict, as well as asking the question as to how the long-running series could have ended differently. Star Trek Away Team is a great example of a genre that I don't generally like, that being real-time tactics, getting a coat of Star Trek paint and then managing to hook me in enough to see it to its conclusion. Away Team features a pretty good story built around a new set of characters and explores the shadier side of Starfleet, with the player assuming control of a group of Special Forces operatives as they conduct a variety of covert missions. These missions are framed as away missions, and before each one you are able to select from a variety of crew members, each with different abilities. Now, the game does sometimes mandate one or two particular abilities per mission, however outside of this, there is a fair degree of freedom in the crew and abilities you select. If you are a player who prefers stealth, then you might select crew members with stealth abilities, whereas if you prefer to go in all guns blazing, you might select crew who are more proficient with heavy weapons or grenades. Once you do have your crew assembled, you lead them through an isometric level view as you complete the various objectives needed to progress. The view works well most of the time, however there are times when line of sight becomes an issue for squad attacks, as well as the AI pathing not always traversing the path intended, resulting in some extreme cases as a mission failure. However, despite the occasional challenges with the camera and control, Away Team is a solid entry in Trek gaming, as well as being the only real tactics game built for the franchise. Klingon Academy serves as a prequel to the sixth movie, Star Trek The Undiscovered Country, and sees the player assuming the role of a Klingon military cadet as they work to uncover a plot against their own government from within, all while progressing through the training ranks of the Academy. The game tells its story via FMV sequences featuring a variety of actors, including Christopher Plummer reprising his role as General Chang. Now, FMV sometimes gets a bad rap in games, but the production quality here is insanely high, and it really elevates the entire experience. The main part of the game is the 3D space simulation, and this is an extremely immersive experience while being approachable enough for mainstream audiences, in part helped by a very detailed tutorial system which is presented as a series of training missions. The game's physics are also another strong point, with all of the ships, both friendly and enemy, feeling like large capital ships as opposed to small fighters. Gameplay-wise, there is a lot to keep the player busy, with a mixture of primary and secondary objectives, as well as a large roster of ships with various new weapons and abilities unlocking as the game progresses. The game is certainly not perfect, with some ideas not quite landing as well as others. Planetary bombardment is one example, as well as the game's insistence of enemies ramming you, but overall, the game serves as a very faithful entry in Trek gaming and a great follow-up to the movie. When Across the Unknown was first announced, I was skeptical. I even made a video and questioned the validity of basing it on the Voyager story as opposed to a new setting. However, once I got my hands on the game, my opinion quickly changed, with me sinking hours upon hours into it. The game is somewhat of a survival strategy game with roguelike elements, meaning that every playthrough is different, and this is where the game really shines, with no two runs being quite the same, with a fair amount of freedom as to just what kind of Voyager you want to build. If you want to build a tank-like combat machine that aces any combat challenges, you can do that. If you want to build a diplomacy machine complete with multiple trade and commodity bays, you can do that too. The best thing about the game is that there's no real right or wrong way to play. Across the Unknown also nails its user interface, providing both an authentic Star Trek experience and an intuitive design to support the gameplay. Perhaps the only challenge I had with the game was that at launch it was punishingly difficult on the higher difficulties, to the extent that I saw the game overscreen frequently on these modes. That and the fact that the voice acting is very limited, and as I pointed out in my review, I think we need to be careful what we wish for here, because adding every Voyager actor to the voice roster would have likely increased the game's price in an already inflationary environment. Across the Unknown seems to have gathered a fair bit of criticism online, but for me, this is a worthy entry in any top 10 list. Despite a fairly confusing name which suggests more of an edutainment title than a video game, 25th Anniversary is an excellent game which really feels like the 4th season of the original series that we never got, complete with an original set of stories which feel like they were ripped straight from the series. The game itself is a mixture of ship management and away missions, with the away missions making up the majority of the game. These away missions are a side-scrolling affair, with various members of the crew joining you to navigate alien planets, ships, and even space stations, with exploration and dialogue at the core of the adventure. There's also somewhat of a branching path system, where particular actions or dialogue options can result in a different mission ending, and on the topic of dialogue, virtually all of the original cast reprise their roles here, and they are excellent. There's definitely been a few Trek games which have phoned in dialogue, but this is definitely not the case here, with everything sounding very convincing, including some of the more hilarious dialogue options. Now, within the ship management there is combat, and this is definitely the weakest part of the game. I think some credit does need to be given that it's essentially 3D space combat in 1992. However, the issue is the Enterprise moves at the speed of a snail, and the enemy moves at the speed of a fighter. The one saving grace is that combat isn't overly frequent, but when it does come up, it's certainly a chore. Overall though, 25th Anniversary is a rock-solid game that any original series fan should play. Based on the tabletop game Starfleet Battles, Starfleet Command sees the player take command of one of 6 races as they move through a series of campaign and randomly generated missions as they build out their ultimate fleet. There's a variety of playable factions, with each featuring quite substantial differences, ensuring there's a lot of replayability between playthroughs. Firstly, there's the Federation with quite strong defensive systems, the Klingons with disruptors and cloaking devices, the Romulans with cloaking and very powerful plasma torpedoes, the Hydrons with the Hellbore and deployable fighters, the Lyrans with the expandable field generator, and the Gorn with plasma torpedoes with very wide firing arcs. Starfleet Command definitely has some strategy elements to it, which no doubt tie back to the tabletop game Origins, but it's a rewarding strategy loop, with all of the missions feeling like there's a good degree of strategy required, as opposed to just going in all guns blazing. As you do progress through the game, you can upgrade and purchase new ships, with more advanced weapons and defenses available. And this has one drawback which I didn't like in the late 90s, and I still don't like. The game scales all of the enemies to your own ships. If you have 1 frigate, you will likely see 1 enemy frigate. If you have 2 destroyers, you will likely see 2 enemy destroyers. The problem is this prevents the player from ever really feeling powerful, as they're always fairly evenly matched. Alas, an argument could probably be made that this again calls back to the strategy game roots. Despite this, Starfleet Command is probably my number 2 most played Star Trek game of all time, with me spending many of my teenage years playing it in both single and multiplayer, with it also occasionally getting a new playthrough every few years just to re-experience it. Armada takes some of the best parts from Starfleet Command and adds base building, larger fleets, and a more focused story to deliver arguably the best Star Trek strategy game ever released. One of Armada's key strengths lies in the game engine's versatility to deliver a wide range of missions to support a very good story with personal touches, while still delivering an expansive strategy game. There's sections in the game where you might need to navigate a mission in a single ship, and others where you will need to build large bases, produce ships, and tackle multiple faction threats, all while keeping a close eye on resources. I don't generally like resource-based games because I find they often feel tedious to manage. However, in the case of Armada, it's really only one resource that's critical, that being dilithium, with the other resources of crew and officers being natural additions once you begin the base building. This streamlined focus on resources shifts a lot more focus to combat, and this is really where the game shines brightest, with large-scale fleet battles between both ships and bases. There's also a level of depth within the combat tied back to the base building, with new weapons and defenses able to be researched, increasing the overall power of your fleet. Armada was also one of the first games to feature the Borg as a playable faction in a Trek game, and of all the 4-faction campaigns, the Borg is by far my favourite. There's a lot of detail that's gone into the Borg here, and they really feel, as they should, very different to all other factions, as opposed to a reskin of an existing one. Armada is one of the few games on this list that I would say is quite approachable for non-Trekkies. Yes, you will miss a lot of the story context, but the overall presentation and UI do a great job of explaining everything needed to have some fun, regardless of your history. Elite Force is one of the best first-person shooters available that just so happens to be a Star Trek game. Based on the supremely popular Quake 3 engine, Elite Force tells the story of the Hazard team based on the USS Voyager during the series' original run. Story-wise, it feels like somewhat of a Voyager movie, with its fair share of twists and turns, all underpinned by some excellent cinematography and voice acting during the game's many cutscenes. The funny thing about Elite Force is that as a shooter, it doesn't take many risks, but it doesn't actually need to. The Quake 3 engine does a great job of delivering the basics of things like camera and control, with the developers then using the engine to create a good mix of memorable levels, characters, and weapons. Oh, and on the topic of weapons, they are a real standout here, with not only a mixture of traditional Starfleet weapons, but a selection of alien weapons, and even a mobile photon torpedo launcher. On top of the levels themselves, Voyager itself serves as somewhat of a hub level, with the player able to explore various areas of the ship, which have been recreated with incredible detail. Honestly, even all these years later, this is probably the most realistic Voyager we have ever seen, and that's including Across the Unknown. There's not much that doesn't work here, with the game's relatively short campaign length, clocking in at just over 7 hours, probably the only wrinkle in an otherwise excellent shooter. Birth of the Federation is objectively the least stable and most bug-ridden Star Trek game I have played, maybe ever. And I'm not talking about playing it on modern hardware, I'm talking about playing the original CD game on era-appropriate hardware. So what's it doing at number 2 on my best of list? Well, put simply, it may be full of bugs, but the overall immersion and expression the game provides the player still hasn't been topped over 25 years later. The game isn't simply a strategy game with a Star Trek wrapper, it's a strategy game that has the Star Trek universe front and center of every in-game mechanic, from diplomacy to combat and everything in between. There's also a very distinct difference depending on which playable faction you choose to play as, again with everything from diplomacy and combat changing depending on the faction you choose. For example, new races you encounter during the game will be far more receptive to you if you were playing as the Federation, as opposed to, say, the Cardassians. This has a very big impact onto how the campaign actually plays out, with the player being able to select either a domination win condition, controlling over 60% of the map, or a vendetta win condition, with the requirement being to completely eliminate your faction's mortal enemies. The actual strategy element revolves around making a variety of decisions around managing and expanding your empire, with things like research and security playing an instrumental role in your success. The only reason this isn't number 1 on my list is because of the bugs, which are numerous and quite serious, with the game seriously slowing down once you progress into the hundreds of turns. Bugs aside though, Birth of the Federation is still one of the greatest Star Trek games ever produced. There's been many Star Trek games which have tried to capture the feeling of Starship Command. However, all of them pale in comparison to the number 1 on this list, Star Trek Bridge Commander. The thing about Bridge Commander is that virtually every part of the game's presentation is immaculate, with everything from space combat to ship management and everything in between just being a lot of fun to play. The game is backed by an excellent story which brings back some old and new enemies with an immense amount of character detail pulled directly from the Next Generation series. But perhaps the best part of Bridge Commander is just how balanced the gameplay is between ship management and ship combat. There's no doubt that part of the fun in any command simulator is ship management. However, this often takes a back seat when combat comes into play, with the player having to focus exclusively on offense and defense. However, in the case of Bridge Commander, everything feels very well connected in both areas of the game, ensuring it feels more like a continuous adventure as opposed to a set of standalone levels. The audio is also exceptional, with all of the original cast lending their voices to their virtual characters, as well as very faithful effects and music. Perhaps the biggest compliment I can pay Bridge Commander is that even in modern times, it is still very approachable for both veterans and newcomers to the series, despite originally releasing all the way back in 2002. Overall, Bridge Commander was an easy choice for my number one, and still a game I play regularly to this day. So there we have it, my top 10 Star Trek games. Were any of them surprises to you? Let me know down in the comments below, and as always, thanks for watching.